The moment everything shifted wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a shouting match or a betrayal. It wasn't a fight that left bruises or slammed doors. It was quiet. Too quiet. I remember sitting there, completely lost in the moment with him, feeling like the world had narrowed down to just the two of us, laughing at our own private jokes, talking about nothing and everything, feeling safe. And then the door opened. No warning, no knock, just light spilling into the room, and him freezing beside me. It wasn't the sudden exposure itself that hurt the most. It was the look. Disappointment, shock, and something worse, a judgment that I felt pierce straight through me. 3 words were all it took. That's not okay. I didn't move. I didn't respond. I just felt it. Shame. Heavy, suffocating, creeping into my chest and my stomach. A feeling that whispered I was wrong for wanting something so simple, so human, closeness. And for the first time, I started questioning everything I had thought about myself, about us, about what love even meant. That night, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to replay the scene in my head. We hadn't hurt anyone. We hadn't done anything reckless. We were just close. And now, that closeness felt tainted. It wasn't embarrassment, not exactly. It was shame. And it hurt more than embarrassment ever could. Because shame sticks. It lingers in the quiet corners of your mind, in your thoughts, in your body. And the worst part? Once it enters a relationship, it changes everything. If you've ever been made to feel guilty for caring about someone, if you've ever questioned your own feelings because someone older decided you crossed a line, if you've ever confused protection with humiliation, you're not alone. On this channel, we tell the stories people are too afraid to say out loud, the quiet heartbreaks, the misunderstood moments, the relationships that didn't explode, they slowly faded. Not all breakups are dramatic. Some are subtle. Some are shaped by fear. Some are shaped by shame. And sometimes, the ones that happen when you're young leave the deepest marks. So if you've ever felt judged for your feelings, stay. Listen. This one might feel familiar. I was 15 when I met him. Same grade, same classes, same awkward phase of figuring out who I was becoming. We were both sensitive, both overwhelmed easily. Being close to each other felt grounding, safe, like a quiet harbor in a storm. When he held my hand, the chaos outside seemed to fade. When he leaned his head on my shoulder, my chest felt lighter. We weren't reckless kids. We talked about boundaries constantly. What are you comfortable with? Are you okay? Tell me if you ever want to stop. We promised to take things slow. We promised not to rush. We promised to respect each other's feelings. And we meant it. But adults don't see the conversations. They see proximity. They see 2 teenagers sitting close together and imagine the worst. My mom would tense up if she saw us together for more than a few seconds. "Remember what happens when you get carried away," she would say. Those words lived in my head, as if one moment of closeness erased all reason, as if being young and affectionate automatically meant disaster. I tried not to let it bother me, because when I was with him, I felt safe. I felt understood. I felt like I belonged somewhere. Until that day at his house. We were sitting together, wrapped in a blanket, talking quietly, laughing about something silly. Door closed, not locked. It was warm, it was normal. Then the door opened. No knock, no warning. His mom stood there. Her gaze cut through the air like a knife. Not angry, not yelling, just disappointed. "That's not okay," she said. The words echoed in the room, and suddenly the world shifted. She talked about responsibility, about consequences, about how quickly things can get out of control. And I kept thinking, we weren't out of control. We weren't doing anything wrong. We were just close. But closeness had become wrong. I went home that night and stared at the ceiling, thinking about what had just happened. Why did I feel ashamed? Why did my heart feel like it had been squeezed by invisible hands? Why did a moment that had once felt safe now feel like a crime? It wasn't embarrassment, not exactly. It was shame, and it hurt more than embarrassment ever could. Because shame sticks. It lingers in the quiet corners of your mind, in your thoughts, in your body. And the worst part? Once it enters a relationship, it changes everything. The next day at school, I noticed subtle differences in how we interacted. We were quieter, more careful. Every glance, every laugh, every touch seemed measured. The innocence of our friendship and first love felt fragile, like a glass ornament teetering on the edge of a shelf. I wanted to laugh again, to feel free with him, but even when we were alone, I hesitated, afraid of doing something wrong, afraid of feeling wrong. Shame had crept in, silent and insidious, and once it arrives, it infects everything. Our moments together weren't fun anymore. They were cautious. Our conversations weren't relaxed, they were guarded. And slowly, I started to wonder if something was really wrong with me. After that day at his house, something changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, just subtly. We still sat together at lunch, we still whispered jokes across the cafeteria, we still walked side by side between classes, but everything carried weight now. Every glance felt heavier. Every touch carried an invisible question: am I doing something wrong? I remember one afternoon sitting in the library across from him, staring down at the table. I feel like we're different now, I whispered. He nodded slowly, avoiding my gaze. He said, I know. I don't I don't want to mess anything up. And that sentence, innocent as it seemed, hit harder than any argument could. Because it wasn't about love, it was about fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being judged. Fear that what had once felt safe was now dangerous. I realized something then. Adults hadn't just interrupted a moment, they had rewritten it. They had painted us as reckless, careless, irresponsible, and now we were starting to believe it. The tension crept into everything. We would sit together and I'd find myself thinking, am I leaning too close? Am I talking too much? Am I asking for too much attention? Every shared laugh, every quiet conversation became a careful negotiation of appropriate behavior. And the more we tried to act normal, the more anxious we became. One afternoon, I overheard her mom talking in the kitchen while we were sitting in the living room. I walked in on them behaving inappropriately. Her words echoed in my mind like a bell I couldn't unring. We hadn't been doing anything wrong. We hadn't even crossed boundaries we had set ourselves. But now it was official. That's how someone else saw us. That day, I went home and stared at the ceiling, thinking, replaying, wondering if I had really done something wrong. And for the first time, I started to doubt myself. Our friends noticed the change too. You guys okay? One of them asked casually. Yes, we said. Because how could we explain the invisible weight pressing on us? How could we explain that the problem wasn't us? It was how the world had decided to see us. We became quieter together, more reserved. Every word and gesture filtered through a lens of shame. Even small touches like brushing against each other's hands now felt like a test of whether we were still innocent enough, a test of whether we were still acceptable. And the worst part? We were starting to fail it, at least in our own minds. Arguments started to creep in. Not explosive fights, not shouting matches, just tension. The kind that sits in your chest and makes every conversation feel like a minefield. Did I do something wrong? I asked quietly one night over text. Maybe, he replied, hesitating. And that single word crushed me, because it wasn't yes and it wasn't no. It was doubt, suspicion, the quiet, gnawing feeling that nothing we did was ever truly right anymore. I began replaying every moment in my head, every laugh, every smile, every hug. Was it too much, too bold, too forward? The relationship that had once been comforting and safe had transformed into a constant internal negotiation of guilt. And then came the discovery moment. We were sitting in his room one weekend, quietly talking about school and friends. He left his phone on the bed for a moment while checking something in the kitchen. I saw a notification pop up, a text from his mom. "I hope they're behaving themselves. I don't want them doing anything they'll regret." That sentence hit me like a punch. It wasn't angry, it wasn't yelling, it was judgment, slow and quiet, and it carried a weight I couldn't shake. I realized something crucial. We were being watched, measured, and defined not by what we did, but by what someone feared we might do. And that realization shattered something inside me. We had been careful, thoughtful, respectful. We had communicated constantly, asking for each other's comfort and consent. We had rules and boundaries, and we followed them. But none of that mattered to the people around us. We weren't allowed to just be teenagers. We weren't allowed to be human. We weren't allowed to make small mistakes or explore closeness safely. And slowly, the anxiety seeped in, the suspicion, the feeling that everything we did, everything we wanted was wrong. Every smile felt guilty, every conversation felt heavy, every laugh felt dangerous. And eventually, the weight became unbearable. The emotional collapse happened quietly, not with screaming or dramatic exit. It happened in a lunchroom one afternoon, sitting across from him, both of us staring at our hands. I I don't know if I can do this, he said, and I understood immediately. It wasn't about love, it wasn't about not caring. It was about exhaustion. Exhaustion from constantly negotiating normal teenage closeness under a microscope. Exhaustion from being made to feel guilty for wanting affection. The cracks had become too visible. The innocence of our first love had been chipped away by fear and judgment, and there was no going back. We parted ways slowly after that, not with anger, not with betrayal, just with the quiet sadness of knowing that love alone wasn't enough to withstand the weight of shame. And that is how a relationship that had once been a safe harbor began to crumble. Not because we were reckless, not because we were careless, but because the world outside decided that our closeness was dangerous. The anxiety, the suspicion, and the quiet judgment had won. And I was left wondering, had I done something wrong? Or had the world just convinced me that I had? The day it truly ended wasn't dramatic. There were no yelling matches, no slammed doors, no tears spilled in public. It was quiet. Too quiet. We met outside after school, in that empty parking lot behind the gym, the place where we'd shared so many small, simple moments. Cold air wrapped around us. Our breaths formed clouds that floated into the sky like fragile reminders of how we used to be. He didn't look at me. I think, I think we should slow down, he said, finally. My chest tightened. My stomach sank. I, we already did, I whispered, unsure if my voice even reached him. No, he said, voice low. I mean everything. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about me, it wasn't about him, it wasn't even about us. It was about fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being judged, fear of feeling too much, caring too much, being too visible in a world that wanted us small. I understood it logically, but understanding didn't make it hurt any less. We had been careful, thoughtful, respectful. We had boundaries and communicated constantly. We had promised each other that we would take things slow, always. But none of that mattered anymore. Because the world outside had decided that we were reckless, that our love, our closeness, our connection was somehow dangerous, and we had started to believe it. The walk home was silent. Not awkward, not angry, just heavy. We carried the weight of the breakup without speaking, and I couldn't stop the tears when I got home. I didn't even bother trying. I lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling for hours, letting it all out. Not anger, not betrayal, grief. Pure, unfiltered grief. I cried for what we had. I cried for what we lost. I cried for the moments that would never feel safe again. The first few days afterwards were the hardest. I kept expecting him to text me. I kept imagining seeing him in the halls. I kept wondering if it had been my fault, if my need for closeness had somehow pushed him away. And slowly, I realized the truth. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't even the relationship's fault. It was the shame we had been made to carry, the judgment we had internalized, the pressure to shrink ourselves so that others wouldn't be uncomfortable. That was what broke us. In the silence that followed, I began to reflect. I thought about the moments before the door had opened that day. I thought about how natural it felt to be close to someone who truly understood me. I thought about how much I had grown in that relationship, how much I had learned about trust, communication, and love. And I realized something important. I wasn't broken. I wasn't inappropriate. I hadn't done anything wrong. The shame hadn't been mine. It had been given to me, and I didn't have to carry it anymore. Slowly, life began to return to normal. I laughed again, first awkwardly, then freely. I shared moments with friends without measuring every action. I started to trust my own feelings again, instead of doubting myself constantly. And with that trust came clarity. I realized that being young doesn't mean being incapable of responsibility. It doesn't mean that your emotions are dangerous. It doesn't mean that wanting closeness is wrong. It just means that you're learning how to navigate a world that doesn't always understand you. There were moments of temptation to reach out to him, to text him, to apologize, to explain that it hadn't been our fault. But I didn't, because I understood something else. Healing wasn't about fixing the past. Healing was about reclaiming myself, reclaiming the right to feel, to love, and to exist without shame. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, the grief softened. Not entirely gone, but lighter, like a shadow that followed me quietly instead of weighing me down. And in that shadow, I found something else. Strength. The kind of strength that doesn't scream or shout, but quietly reminds you that you're whole. The kind of strength that says, you are allowed to love. You are allowed to feel. You are allowed to grow. I started noticing changes in myself I hadn't expected. I became more aware of my boundaries, more confident in my decisions, more willing to trust my instincts. And slowly, the internal shift became undeniable. I wasn't ashamed anymore. I wasn't small anymore. I wasn't someone who needed to hide or apologize for existing. I was awake, and that awakening was the most profound part of the breakup. Looking back, I can see the beauty in what we had. Not the heartbreak, not the shame, not the loss. The beauty was in the lessons. The beauty was in the way we taught each other trust and communication. The beauty was in the way we learned what it meant to care deeply and honestly, without fear. And even though it ended, even though it hurt, even though I cried more than I thought possible, I was grateful. Grateful for the first time I understood the depth of emotion. Grateful for the first time I realized that closeness is not shameful. Grateful for the first time I saw that growing up sometimes means leaving someone behind, not because you stop loving them, but because you need to love yourself more. The awakening wasn't sudden. It didn't come with fireworks or dramatic revelations. It came quietly, slowly, like the first light of morning creeping over a dark room, soft, gentle, inevitable. I wasn't broken. I wasn't lost. I was finally awake. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest pain. After our breakup, the first few weeks felt endless. I walked through the hallways like a ghost, avoiding the spots where we used to sit together, avoiding the memories that clung to every corner. But slowly, life began to move forward. The ache of absence softened into something quieter, something that felt like space, space to breathe, space to grow. I started paying attention to myself in ways I hadn't before. Simple things, my posture, the way I smiled, the way I spoke to friends. I had lost myself a little in the weight of judgment, and now I was reclaiming her, me. I threw myself into my passions, art, writing, music. Whatever made me feel alive, I pursued it with a quiet intensity. The more I focused on myself, the lighter my heart became. And somewhere along the way, I realized I was thriving. Not because I had someone to validate me, not because someone else needed me, but because I had learned to validate myself. Months later, he reached out. "Hey, hope you're doing okay," the text read. I stared at my phone for a long time. Part of me wanted to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely. But I did something I hadn't done before. I paused. I thought about how far I had come, about how much I had learned, about how much strength I had built in the quiet aftermath of our relationship. And I realized the truth. I didn't need to prove anything to him. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need him to see my growth. I was enough. So I didn't reply immediately. I didn't rush to explain myself. I let him sit in the awareness of what he had missed. And it felt good. Not vengeful, not mean, just right. I also started noticing social cues I had ignored before. Mutual friends would comment on my confidence, my energy, my sense of humor. I laughed more freely. I didn't shrink to fit anyone's idea of who I should be. I started experimenting with my style, my voice, my presence. I started taking care of my body, not for anyone else, but for me. Little victories, finishing a project I had been avoiding, speaking up in class, setting boundaries with people who tried to make me feel small. The more I reclaimed myself, the less I cared about the shame that once ruled me. And then came a small, unexpected moment of poetic justice. I saw him one day in the hall, weeks after the last text. He looked at me. I smiled. I didn't shrink. I didn't apologize for being myself. He looked unsettled, confused, like he didn't recognize the girl he had once thought he knew. And I realized something important. Emotional justice isn't about revenge. It's about being so unapologetically yourself that the world has no choice but to notice. It's not about making someone regret the past. It's about proving to yourself that you're whole, that you're worthy, that you matter. I had learned how to protect myself, not by shutting down, not by hiding, but by embracing my truth, by loving myself fiercely and gently at the same time. I didn't need anyone to tell me that wanting closeness was okay. I already knew. And I didn't need anyone to tell me that I was growing into someone strong. I could feel it in my spine, in my voice, in the way I carried myself. Life went on. School went on. Friendships deepened. I grew. And I knew, without a doubt, that I had survived the hardest part, not just the breakup, but the internalized shame, the fear, and the guilt. I had survived myself. And surviving yourself is the hardest, most important thing you can ever do. How many of us learn shame before we learn self-trust? How many of us were told our feelings were too much before anyone taught us how to handle them? How many relationships end not because of betrayal, but because someone convinced us our emotions were dangerous? I think about those questions often, because the truth is, love isn't always enough, because growth doesn't always come from being protected, it comes from learning to stand on your own. If you've ever been made to feel embarrassed for wanting closeness, I hope you know this. Your feelings are valid. Your boundaries are valid. Your need for affection, care, and connection is valid. The world may try to shame you, but that doesn't mean you are wrong. And sometimes the most powerful act of love is learning to give it to yourself first. If this story resonated with you, tell me, have you ever been made to feel guilty for something that felt innocent? Do you think teens deserve more trust or more protection? Share your thoughts below. And if you believe stories like this deserve space without judgment, make sure you subscribe to the Breakup Stories. Because next time, we're talking about a relationship that didn't end quietly. And that one, it changes everything. Until then, be gentle with your younger self. And remember, growing up isn't about perfection, it's about learning, surviving, and reclaiming your right to feel.